Okay, thank you for coming to our talk. And this can be interactive. People may or may not trickle in, but this can be interactive. I have a lot of material, and so hopefully this will allow you some food for thought to think about some things you may want to implement your own teaching, pedagogy, teaching and instruction. The reason I wanted to play that hip hop song by Andy Mineo and Lecrae is often when we think of music, it's indicative of our ideas about curriculum. Often when we think of music and acceptable music, we think of something like this, which I like this as well. And I love Chopin. When we think of this as the highest music, the best kind of music, when we study music, we think of this as the standard. And I'm not denying, oops, I didn't mean to cut it off. I'm not denying that this is not good, great music. In fact, my wife is a classical pianist, and a lot of her studies involve, this is our favorite classical pianist, but it's based on the ideas that I'm going to talk about in terms of a Eurocentric curriculum being the best and the standard to aim for. One could argue that both pieces of music um, have some usefulness in terms of studying music and studying history and studying curriculum, studying the arts. So that's basically some opening thoughts in terms of what I want to say. My talk is seeing myself in the curriculum, using more diverse resources in the classroom, in classrooms. I want to start off with a piece by Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. This is a wonderful novel if you haven't seen it. One of the things I'm going to be doing is including examples of how you might diversify your curriculum at the university level. Quote, I'm an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I might even be said to, excuse me, possess a mind. I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me. This particular piece is by an African American author, and I use this because when we diversify curriculum, we get a more full picture of humanity. I can identify with this in particular because sometimes what Ellison is saying is one may overlook a person of color in society and devalue them. Many times I felt like that in the educational system. So as teachers and professors, administrators, professors, and so forth, we want to have an open mind in terms of who's in our classroom. And when he says overlook, when he says invisible, he means overlook. So for example, if you have African American young men or Latinx individuals or Middle Eastern, sometimes we will focus on a certain group and overlook those others. And that's what he means by invisible man. If this had not been an African American author, perhaps he may not have been able to get at that notion. And as we think about this piece, it can help us understand the importance of diversifying our curriculum. Challenging a Eurocentric epistemology. Epistemology is a word that comes from the field of philosophy, and you may have seen it before. It has to do with the study of knowledge, study of how we know what we know. It's related to metacognition, thinking about thinking. But epistemology, we like to ask the questions as educational philosophers: whose knowledge are we privileging? Whose knowledge do we deem as important and the best? And I have two works up here that are really both quite brilliant pieces of scholarship. You see Shakespeare, and then also you see a piece by Zora Neale Hurston, the famed author, poet. She was also a playwright. So just like William Shakespeare, Zora Neale Hurston is a playwright. And so to the classically trained person, the traditionally minded person, the scholar of yesteryear, they would not have put Zora Neale Hurston in the same category. Why? Primarily because she's a black woman. Black women have not, women in general have not been thought of as intellectuals. I'm a historian, by the way, if you don't know me. I should have introduced myself. I'm David Child. This is my university. Um, and I do history and education in the College of Education. I'm a historian, and I direct the Black Studies program. So a lot of this is reflective of my work. And from a historical standpoint, women have been devalued. Women have been thought of as not having the same intellectual capacity as men. In fact, this country, from the mid 1800s, or really all the way up till really the mid 20th century, women have not had the same educational access. In the 1800s, women were often not allowed to go to school because they were looked at as domestic workers and only primarily useful for child rearing. And then there was also thought that women were not, as I said earlier, could not do the intellectual work. So think about the intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality. Think about that being a black woman, and her dates are the early 20th century. And this is a brilliant work. Color Struck, by the way, it's a play. It was originally published in 1926 in a magazine called Fire. Color Struck won second prize in the contest for best play. It was produced during the Harlem Renaissance, which is a period in the early 20th century where you had black excellence. You had black playwrights, you had poetry being produced, you had film, you had art. It was a renaissance for the black community. The plot for Color Struck, I can't remember if there's a movie version or not. Sometimes I like to go back and look at the films that were derived from plays. Color Struck opens a train in 1900s. It takes place in the 1900s with members of the black community from Jacksonville, Florida. They're on their way to a dance. At any rate, the play deals with the notion of colorism, where people of African descent discriminate against one another because of color variations, colors of your skin. And she plays with that whole notion, and it comes from the idea that often people of lighter skin are treated better historically, and so she deals with that sophisticated idea. Another example of if she had not been a woman of color, she can get at ideas and notions that other people may not be able to address. She has a unique experience. Thus, it shows us that when we diversify our curriculum, we can get a better picture of society. That we're not taking away from Shakespeare's work and what William Shakespeare is doing. He was a brilliant scholar as well, but we're talking about broadening the curriculum. These are just some theoretical and philosophical frameworks from which I've drawn. James Banks is a foremost scholar in multicultural education. He talks about different levels of multicultural education. He says in 4 levels primarily. He says the entry level is the contributions approach, where you barely talk about it. So if I'm teaching a biology class, all of the works that I deal with will be from mainstream artists of a European background, I meant to say authors, white authors. And I may introduce a scholar of color, but the next level would be the additive approach, where I might do a unit in that class, or I might spend a little bit more time thinking about drawing from diverse women scientists, for example. And one of the highest levels, the third level, is the transformational level, where the entire class is centered around. So if I'm teaching a biology class or chemistry class, we're all being thoughtful about diversifying the scholars that we use. Their scientific experiments, I'll show you a little bit later too, that were done by women scientists, but often they're not privileged. That work is not privileged. And so the transformational model, that third model, really gets into that. And then the fourth model is social action, thinking about how we can implement these ideas into societies. That's James Banks' work. Halsey, her work, Enough is Enough, decolonize diversify and deconstruct the curriculum is all about everything that we're talking about right now. A recent national debate wanted to discredit the 1619 project. Have you folks heard about the 1619 project? That whole debate. The 1619 project was a particular curriculum framework by Nicole Hannon Jones. She was a writer from the New York Times, and she aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the United States national narrative. So when she talks about history, she wants to be intentional about looking at the role that the legacy of slavery played in the U.S. That's the 1619 project. It got a lot of backlash. And so as a result, they came out with the 1776 project, or the 1776 commission. It was an advisory committee established in September 2020 by then President Donald J. Trump. The commission, which included no historians specializing in the United States history, released the 1776 project as a counter to the 1619 project. There has also been the rise of so-called critical race theory legislation. Even in Kentucky, some of this legislation has passed that made I guess you could say illegal for teachers to teach what they term divisive curriculum that's going to make the students feel bad about being white. And so I was just at a high school teaching, Dollar High School, a couple of days ago, and I accidentally talked about critical race theory a little bit. And some of the teachers laughed, some looked nervous. I didn't intend on doing it, I was just making a reference. And so there's legislation out there that's limiting teaching Black history, teaching about diversity, such and so forth. It's all based on this idea that the history we should be teaching, not just history, but the curriculum should be Eurocentric. These are some questions I want you to think about. Why is it important to have a more diverse curriculum across campus? And by the way, feel free to chime in or answer or give a thought if you want. Does this benefit all of society or just underrepresented minorities? What I want you to think about is often when we have these kinds of conversations, the idea is that this is something that benefits minorities only, and those of European background do not have to think about these things. Why not? When university educators diversify curriculum, does this imply that using the work of European scholars is somehow wrong? It does not, of course. In what ways can we be more intentional by diversifying our curriculum, or even those at an administrative capacity? How can we have larger conversations across campus, programmatic kinds of conversations and implementations to bring about, as I said, implementation of a more diverse curriculum? What kinds of conversations do we need to have? Sometimes it's one classroom at a time, one professor at a time. Because if one class in the program is doing this kind of work and 5 other professors are not doing this kind of work, you only get that kind of material in that particular classroom. But these ideas need to be programmatic. What are the benefits of using diverse authors and other resources in our teaching? So that's what I want us to think about. This is interesting. A recent U.S. history textbook published by McGraw-Hill reads, quote, "The Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and the 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to southern United States to work on agricultural plantations." Now, this is an advanced high school textbook. What is wrong with that quote? What are your thoughts on that quote? Take a look at that. 1500s, 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to southern United States. What are your thoughts on that? This is the actual text. McGraw-Hill is one of our standard textbooks in history.
They brought millions of people.
What'd you say?
People.
People.
Human beings.
Human beings,
Not
okay.
animals.
Okay. What do you think about using the term workers in this particular passage?
You know, this reminds me of, I recently, well, this semester I took students to, a tour, like, work at a community college.
Okay.
Doing a lot of transfer visits. So I took students to WKU for a transfer visit, and we also went to McKay. And our tour guide was given to a McKay, we were talking about how slaves, you know, make paths and get tours and stuff in the caves and things. And then at one point, he says that there was a slave who was giving tours, and we'll just call him his boss, gave him, you know, let's come out here. I said, wait, hold up, his boss? His slave owner, his master, that's completely, I said, and I told my students, I said, just like that he changed that one word, he changes history. And oral history is very important. So you have to do your own research, because one word makes something totally different than what it actually is.
That's
They
true.
didn't come over here just because they needed employment, they didn't want to come and get a better job.
Right.
So, you know, so
Yeah.
it's, sometimes it really is, just that one word changes the entire thing.
And the word epistemology that I talked about in the beginning of the talk has to do with knowledge production. Who controls the narrative? And a lot of times in societies that are oppressive, they change the history. That's what Stalin did. Joseph Stalin, in the former Soviet Union, a lot of people didn't know the true history. He was always changing the narrative, and they sanctioned and censored censored textbooks that went out. The government was changing the narrative, changing the textbooks. So a lot of the people didn't know the true history. And so that's what we sort of have going on here. We're getting a partial history. And I always want to say that we're not saying that Western civilization, studying European history is not important, but we haven't gotten the total picture. As you can see, this is African American men and women, children picking cotton, the cotton field, and placed in the straw bushel basket. My grandmother was a sharecropper in Georgia, and she grew up on a plantation. She grew up on a plantation that my ancestors had been enslaved. And she came into my history class one time and showed us cotton. And she grew up in that environment picking cotton till she was in her 40s. And she moved to Ohio, which she called up north. And she talked about how they worked from sun up to sundown. They had burlap dresses made out of those burlap bags, and she lived in a similar situation as this.
David, I'm sorry.
Please.
The former picture, even the picture itself kind of sanitizes things.
Yes.
Right? You see like the men, women, and children together, so you assume the families together, and
Yes.
they're clothed, and you know even the choice of picture presents a different
You're right.
perspective.
That's a whole larger conversation in terms of how enslavement was portrayed. People in the North really did not know how bad enslavement was until Uncle Tom's Cabin came out. Because the South tried to hide it, the brutality of slavery, the rape, separation of families. There's a Disney cartoon, Song of the South, that was banned. And the reason it was banned is because it portrayed the enslaved people as happy and benevolent. And they would sometimes portray it as the big bad North came and ruined things. The South was perfect. It's utopia. Till the North came and messed things up. That's a great point. And also I was going to ask the use of the word workers is a very sanitized word. They were enslaved people. They were property. Here's another example. A recent Washington Post op-ed piece gives another example of misinformation. Textbook publishers tend to mystify the reasons for the South's secession, largely because they don't want to offend school districts and thereby lose sales. Isn't that interesting? How sales and marketing and capitalism plays a big part of it. They want the textbook publishers, as we know, textbook publishers make an awful lot of money. Sometimes you can pay as much as $300 a textbook. And then our university has about 15,000 students, 14 to 15,000 students. Imagine how much money is being made. That's why there's a push to try to use online material to have this process to be more economical for students, because for too long, textbooks publishers haven't had a stranglehold on universities, and so therefore they're producing books that are more sanitized. Some of the most widely used history textbooks today even insinuate that the South's motivation for secession was simply to protect states' rights. You'll hear that a lot through the South, especially in Kentucky, a lot of the schools around here. And when I teach this at various schools and middle schools, I let the children know that it was about slavery. States' rights had to do with it, because it was about the Southern states' rights to own slaves.
If you can name me two other states' rights that they were trying to preserve during that time, you let me know what they are.
They wanted the right to own people. So again, that's a sanitized version, and I like this image of the 4th U.S. Infantry Detail, colored troops.
Mentioned that they do it because they make money. When you think about when textbooks were being created and chosen, the people, look at the people who were choosing.
Yeah.
So of course, if they're reading the curriculum, they're reading those textbooks, if it offends them, like, oh no, we can't have that. But if it, just because it offends you or because it strikes a nerve doesn't mean it's not true.
That is so true. And the people that are creating the curriculum and writing the books are generally white males. I can give you an example, a personal example. I was voted recently to, and I didn't know they were going to vote, but it was, I'm voted to successfully to be on the board of the Kentucky Historical Society. So I show up and somebody nominated me, and it's all, white men there. It was like a Masonic, it was dark. It was, if you ever been to, this is a cool place for a historian. It was the old governor's, what was it called? The old governor, what was it called? This old building, the old something or other, where they used to have Kentucky Senate. And it's in Frankfurt. So I show up, it's very dark because of the ambiance in there. And there's all these white men, dressed like I'm dressed. And they had this whole induction ceremony, and I was uncomfortable being the only, they were very friendly, by the way, but just being the only one as usual. And these are the individuals that decide curriculum often, that decide what history is important. That's why we have to diversify spaces, by the way. And so funny story though, I took an oath, and I had to promise that I had not agreed to any duels. It was an outdated oath. And I said I'm thankful I didn't have to, that I'd agreed to any duels before I came here. I wouldn't have been qualified for it. That's one space. And then I also serve on the board of the National Council of Social Studies. And again, I think I'm the only African American, Black man or woman. And I thought, oh my goodness, these are the people that's making some curricular decisions on the national level. No wonder, and these individuals, don't get me wrong, are very progressive in their thinking. But at the same time, sometimes you just need a woman's perspective. You need a person of color's perspective. I can't speak for a woman. I can't write for what it's like to be a woman, and I shouldn't have to. But all too long, that's what's been going on, right? That's why when you read history, meaningful discussions about women are far and few between, even today in our textbooks. Just here are some examples here. High school textbooks often gloss over American government oppression of racial minorities like Native Americans, the plight of Native Americans. They gloss over it. So when they come to us, they've been steeply and often intentionally indoctrinated, steeped in Eurocentric thinking. And the idea is that curriculum, material, textbooks, etc., and so forth, the best textbooks are written by white males. That's the sort of thinking, like the smartest people in our society, the best and brightest are white males. And what I want to continue to put forth is, I'm going to show you some ways to diversify. Actually, that's why I'm sort of hurrying myself along. I got some some things I think you might be very interested in, some material. I got some examples. The point here is not to discredit bullet point 3. The point here is not to discredit the history of those with a European background. We must present a more intellectually honest, that's a word I use a lot. We must be intellectually honest and not intellectually dishonest in terms of how we do history, how we talk about curriculum, how we talk about the world and society. If you've ever traveled abroad and been around people of color in like South America, Central America, or Africa, or Asia, you realize that the world is a lot bigger than us. Or if you don't even have to go abroad, go to New York, California, go across the bridge to Cincinnati. The world looks a lot different from the middle of Kentucky. This is what I've been saying. Diverse voices give us a more full picture of the human experience and can help offer a diversity of ideas. So here's some examples. This is what I wanted to get to. This is a good book. I'm a literature person, and I know Dr. Fair. She's a literature person. I love books. I'm a book nerd. See, I grew up in the inner city, and I actually spent some time homeless. And one of the things that really drew me into education was books and reading. I had a librarian. I went to this elementary school right outside of the project, and we were very poor. Sometimes we didn't have anything to eat. We had electricity, and I think probably one of the worst things was not having heat in the winter. But I had a librarian. She always had books for me. My favorite place was always the library, so that's reflected in my talk today. So I'm going to bombard you with some books before we get out of here. One of my favorite books is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. He deals with Blackness. He deals with sexual identity. He deals with religion. He deals particularly with the Black church, which is one of my favorite topics. He deals with Pentecostalism, traditional rural South culture. It is really a fine book, and he can write so well. I think personally that literature and art can give us glimpses of our humanity in the world and society in a way that no other genre can. Film can do the same thing, but there's some things that literature can go places, like particularly a novel, not just like a textbook. So sometimes when I teach history classes, I'll use a novel along with the sort of dry textbook, because we need that sort of sterile academic language, but at the same time, we need a human experience of what happened in history. So I'm going to just show you some literature that you may or may not have heard of.
He was a pioneer too.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
When you look at it, when he was talking about sexuality and things like that,
Yeah.
this was back in the 60s,
Right.
early 70s.
Yep.
Like, oh, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And he was really, on YouTube, I've seen some of his debates,
Mm-hmm.
and he's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. I like to use his speeches because, in history we call them primary sources. And I was telling the group I'm a historian, so that's kind of how I think about things. A lot of times when we think of primary sources, we think of documents like letters from World War II or plantation records. But a great source of primary source documents are these interviews with people like Baldwin. You could get so much meat and content from that. But here are some great passages. One of my themes that you notice today is that when we use authors and scholars and thinkers and materials from different people, different backgrounds, we get a fuller picture of life. We can get a broader picture of knowledge. And this is a perfect example. He says, quote, "Color is not a human or a personal reality, it's a political reality." And that's just powerful. That's something you have to just let marinate. A political reality, because lots of power is embedded in the notion of whiteness. When I say the notion of whiteness, I mean it as a social construct, because it's not a real thing. It's something we have created socially in our culture. We've attached certain privileges to what it means to be white. In fact, it's codified in a lot of our laws. Conversely, Black bodies, especially in James James Baldwin's time, the suffering he witnessed. Even my own father, my late father, he was an African American poor black preacher in the rural South. He used to talk to me about Jim Crow, how he when they went through certain parts of the South, they couldn't stop at certain restaurants. They had to keep driving. They had to. They used to take shoeboxes and put sandwiches in there so that because they weren't allowed to stop. And when they did stop, when they get closer up north, they had to go around to the back to get their food. And he talks about segregated water fountains and things like that, segregated pools. And my uncle talks about he had some run-ins with the Klan when he was younger, and he was really brutalized by some Klansmen in the South. And so thinking about a person like James Baldwin and my relatives that grew up in that situation, how different might their writing be? What can they say to us in the classroom that others may not be able to say? And it's not taken from a white scholar. There's a whole debate in my field about can white people talk about Black history? They can. I mean, I'm not going to be ethnocentric about it. Some of my most brilliant teachers learned the best. I learned about Black cowboys from my seventh grade middle school teacher. He's a white man, and he was insightful enough to see that I like to read, so he would bring me different books. And I don't know where he found them in the 80s and 90s, but he had these books on Black cowboys, and it planted a seed in me. Like it lit a fire under me. And so I'm not saying that white folks can't talk about this material, but I am saying that we can get a different kind of insight. And when we don't do that, we miss something. Look at the second quote. Black has become a beautiful color, not because it is love, because it is fear. Wow. I think there is a fear of potential. Folks that are insecure about Blackness and talent. And you could say the same thing about Hispanic, Latinx, women. Sometimes people are afraid of women with power, in positions of power and education and et cetera and so forth. So they will try to oppress them and limit them. And that has gone on in this country for a long time. But that fear, but I love what he says, Black has become a beautiful color. And only James Baldwin can say something like that. Another one of my favorite books, everybody knows the movie, Alice Walker's The Color Purple. This is one of those books and movies that I get emotional when I think about the ideas and the notions that are presented in this particular text, because it's so powerful. For example, she says here, folks don't like nobody being too proud or too free. Think about that. What does that say to you? Don't like nobody being. How can we quantify or bring that out more? What does that say to you personally? This is Celie. She's one of them. She is the main character.
You feel like if other people have freedom, you feel like you're somehow losing power or you're losing something. Like it's not like we can't both have something.
Yes.
It's either you or me. I'd rather it be me. So
I love the way you brought that out. Yes.
I think when you think about being too proud, it's like, yeah, well, if I'm saying that, Black Lives Matter, I'm saying that Black people is kind of like, well, why do you feel that way? Like, shouldn't all people feel that way? Like, because I'm proud of who I am, proud of what I am, does not mean that I don't appreciate other, cultures and other races and other backgrounds. And the same thing about being too free is kind of like,
I think
all
this
right,
is one.
okay.
Oh yeah, I was making sure.
I was like, I thought that was just a regular wall. I was like, maybe he works
Yeah,
here, maybe he knows what I do, but
Yeah, I was looking, I'm like, okay.
I had to check. Keep going, though.
Yeah, so if you like too free in terms of, we've allowed you to get this far.
Right.
So you can't be too loud because, you should be blessed to be in this space.
That's right. And power does not have to be competitive. Power can be shared. It makes us better. We're better together, and I think more of us need to realize that. And I always share this with my students. Black Lives Matter too. Okay, let's stop looking at this as like, ethnocentrism. Like black folks are better, but it's like, no, Black Lives Matter too. Like everybody should be valued, and that's what it's trying to say. I had enough bad luck to keep me laughing the rest of my life. Sat in that jail. I sat in that jail till nearby done rot to death. I know what it's like, Miss C, to want to go somewhere in pain. It's really powerful. As I said, literature can get at places that we can't quite understand until we read it, till it comes from the human heart, until it comes from a place of suffering. Alice Walker is an African American woman. I mentioned Zero Neale Hurston earlier. This is her classic text. Their eyes were watching God. Quote, the familiar people and things had failed her, so she hung over the gate and looked up the road towards way off. I like that, towards way off. That's just, I don't know, she has a way with words. She knew now that marriage did not make love. Janie's first dream was dead, so she became a woman. That's really powerful. Zora is sort of saying, in my interpretation, that she defined herself through a man, through marriage. When it didn't work out, she found herself as a woman, and she's trying to say that she doesn't need a marriage to make her fully a woman. She became a woman. So it's a lot to think about. A man probably couldn't write something like this. They could write it from another perspective, but Zora gives us something that we would not have otherwise got had she not been a Black woman. And it just makes the picture more full. I'll give you a couple of historical examples, diverse authors in history courses. The South's obsession was to maintain a government, an economy, an arrangement of the sexes, a relationship of the races, and a social system that had never existed, except in the fertile imagination of those who would not confront either the reality that existed or the change that would bring them closer to reality. This is John Hope Franklin. He's one of the foremost historians of U.S. history. He's passed on, but he wrote about African American history. And he was a historian. A lot of times when we think about historians, we don't think of a person that looks like me. We think of an old white male as being the best and the brightest. We think of Harvard and a white guy with a bow tie on. And again, it's not to take away from white historians, but we need a more totality. We need a more total picture, a broader picture of scholarship and research. This particular quote is talking about white supremacy, the idea of maintaining a social order, a government, an economy, an arrangement of sex, subjugation of women and races that is a racist, sexist society that only benefited some. Even the poor whites did not benefit from the system. Primarily in the South, in the slave South, the primary beneficiaries of that economy was white male, wealthy white males. And they the war was all about maintaining that system. And Franklin, Dr. Franklin here is very insightful in making that point. Paulo Freire is a South American author, historian, philosopher. He passed on too. He has some very powerful things to say that I think can be useful in the classroom. Washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. And thinking about that particular passage, not really speaking out against power, but allowing it to go on, he says, you've heard this notion before, is to side with the powerful. you can't be neutral if you're seeing injustice take place before your eyes. And if you have the power to say something and you let it go, you are siding with the oppressors. Quote, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors when they're in power. Thirdly, attempting to liberate the oppressed without reflective participation. The act of liberation is to treat them as objects that must be saved from a burning building. So in other words, we have to identify with the oppressed, talk to people, see where they're coming from, like our students. We have to have conversations with them, to check in on them. Those that are minoritized background, if we're in an administrative position, don't make assumptions on how they feel. Don't speak for individuals of BIPOC students or what have you, minoritized students. Check in with them, see how they're doing. We all too often speak for them. So this is what I like to show people. Let's take it deeper. I think it's relatively easy to diversify your curriculum with language arts and social studies, but let's look at some examples in the social sciences, the physical sciences, I meant to say. You see some famous women here that have done a lot of good things that are women of color. This is Dr. Margaret S. Collins. She's a well-known scientist, and this is one of her writings, Science and the Question of Human Equality. And so she's a well-known scholar. I like to show these examples because the average person cannot think of a woman of color that's a scientist. The average person, that is not where their mind would go in terms of thinking of science. They think most of the scientists that have done anything of significance are white males. Bless you. This is Ronald Maurice Jefferson. He did work he did work for the United States Natural Arbitorium, a very brilliant scholar that most people have not heard about. His dates where he just passed actually in 1923, 1920. He was a botanist. He was the first African-American botanist to be employed by the United States National Arbitorium, where he worked from 1956 to 1987. According to the Washington Post, he became an international authority on flowering cherry trees. Here are some other examples. Catherine Goebel Johnson, an African-American physicist and mathematician who worked for NASA for decades. Aerospace engineer April Erickson Jackson was the first Black woman to earn a Ph.D. in mechanical engineering from Howard University. Macy Jamison became the first African-American woman to be admitted to the astronaut training program. Alexa Kennedy, the first female African-American neurosurgeon in the U.S. Patricia Bath, Dr. Patricia Bath, she was an inventor, ophthalmologist. And then you see the picture of Jedediah Isler. She is an astrophysicist, young woman. She studies supermassive hyperactive black holes. Can you imagine if more of this information came out to inspire our young people at our universities? And it doesn't have to be sort of, who was the first African-American woman to be admitted to the astronaut training program? What I'm suggesting is to take it 3 or 4 steps beyond that and use their textbooks and their academic journal articles in the classrooms, because they're doing the same work as some of the white males and the Eurocentric curriculum that we're using. They're doing the same work. And many times these folks have a greater insight that's being missed. It is my position that we've missed a lot on God-given human knowledge because we are ignoring large swaths of people in our society, and we have deemed that their work is not important. that their work is substandard. That's the general thought, that the work from Latinx scholars, women of color, black males is inferior to that of white males. And there was a teacher, there's a YouTube clip going around right now of a high school teacher explaining to a room full of African American males in his high school class that he thinks the white race is the most superior out of all of them. And he starts giving this inferior knowledge to substantiate what he's saying, this inaccurate knowledge. And so the picture you see here is Edmonia Lewis. She was actually a black sculptor in the late 1800s. She had a brilliant piece called Forever Free. These are other examples of how you made diversify the curriculum. For visual arts, highlighting the works of black and brown painters and sculptors. For Spanish and Latin American studies, highlighting the work of Afro-Latinos. A lot of times when we think of people of Hispanic descent, we think of, for example, lighter skinned Hispanics, but there's a diversity of Spanish-speaking folks in Latin America that may look like me, but they have a different cultural and language background. One of my favorite examples is advanced mathematics, differential equations. This is getting out of my area. If I had time, I would go and study mathematics at a deeper level because I'm very fascinated by it. So think about advanced mathematics, differential equations, number theory, linear algebra, multivariable calculus, seeking out the work of current scholars of color to integrate into the curriculum. Here's an example. He's currently at Princeton. Dr. Massey was the first African American to earn tenure, I think, in the math department. But his research interests are theories that people or mathematical models that most people don't even know about. Queuing theory, applied probabilities, stochastic processes, special functions, performance modeling. Wouldn't it be amazing to teach some advanced math classes using his books? Most people wouldn't even think to use his books because the publishers probably don't even support a lot of what he does because of everything that I'm talking about. They will look at him, just be honest, and say his work is not, maybe it's substandard. He's a black scholar. Why haven't I heard of him before? Those kinds of things. My own writing, as I close out. So what I've done is wrote some material myself for my students to give my own perspective as an African American author. This is a project I did. I'll show you a little bit of this here online. This is a project I do with National Public Radio. And I write all about diversity. And this is for resources for teachers, educators, professors. That's why I write it, and for the general public. This particular information is along the lines of social sciences. So there are many articles, I think like 160 or something like that, on, I do a lot of work on diversity, you may find useful. I do a whole lot on African American history. I did a series on women's history, talking about intersectionality, how, for example, a Native American woman might have a different experience from a white woman. I write a lot about civic education, democracy. So, for example, I just did something on Thanksgiving recently to privilege Native Americans and their experience. This was a fun one. I did something on African American cultural history, the Black poetry tradition. And I'll give you an example, within the articles, I include poetry, but also I had kind of a database, so you can click on these poets and see their actual works. Then there's some lesson plans for teachers you can use in your classrooms and et cetera and so forth. On every level from elementary all the way to college. Let me show you one more and then I'll close out. I'll mention my book and close out. There was a piece I did on the Black film tradition. If I don't find it right away, I'll just close out. There was a whole tradition There it is. Celebrating Black joy through this historic Black film tradition. Most people may or may not realize that there is a genre of Black filmmaking that goes back to 1918. And because of the things we talked about just now, it has not been privileged, it has been overlooked. Folks have looked at it as it's not valuable, but it is a treasure trove for our classrooms, for classes on diversity, classes on filmmaking, classes on the arts. Going back to 1918, there was all kinds. There's horror films. There's the one called the Black Sherlock Holmes. Different genres. There were Black westerns, music, sports, comedy, and it's American history. And I always say this. I always try to make sure I say this. African American history is American history. Women's history is American history. Latin American history is American history, etc. and so forth. Indian, Native American history is American history. We're getting a more total picture because most time in this country has been very Eurocentric. So, and lastly, my colleague and I, we used to teach language arts and history together, language arts and history methods, and we were both book nerds. We always talked about books for hours. And then one day I said, we should just write our own book for our students. And that's what this is. This is a historical fiction piece. And it's called Escaping from Home. And it is about the story of enslavement and freedom. It's written from a novel. It's a novel, and it's accessible to, I would say, middle school all the way up to high school, or to college. I use it with my college students. And it's a way for me to teach history. So that's about it. I'm sorry I should have paused for questions. I think we got a minute or so if anybody have any comments or questions that you might have.
We're looking for other resources. Where do you like to normally go to? Other than the library?
Other resources which are you an administrator? What's your area?
I teach computers and business, but my focus is online accessibility.
Okay. The keywords for a Google search is really important. Women mathematicians, Black women mathematicians. That's generally where I start. And you have what I would do is look, not only read about film, but look at what they produced. Go to the bottom of the article or to the bottom of Wikipedia and look at the books or articles that they produced. And that's where the meat is. Because a lot of times when we talk about these things, it's sort of like, oh, he was the first inventor of the traffic light, and et cetera and so forth. But we want to go way deeper than that and look at the ideas and the ideals of what these women were saying, what they wrote about, what they cared about, and integrate them in the curriculum. That's the hard part. Because even myself, I use a lot of the same material. I mix it up, but there's some go-to material that I had that I really know. So switching up for a textbook can be take a lot of work, but it's worth it. Hope that helps. Well, other than that, that's it. If somebody had any more questions, I can certainly stick around and answer questions. Thank you so much. You folks are from where y'all all from? Is anybody from NKU that I don't know? Y'all look familiar. Oh, okay. Thank y'all for making the drive out here and spending time with little old us and at NKU.
The campus is, I started out ages ago as a admissions counselor, but this campus has really changed.